Thank you for joining us for this informative American Institute of Chemical Engineers webinar, Critically Thinking About Critical Thinking. Our speakers are Greg Schaefer and Melissa Collins. Greg Schaefer is a performance advisor for TDS who has over 30 years of experience in the petrochemical industry in various roles, including operator, frontline shift supervisor, operations assistant, trainer, facilitator, and plant training coordinator for a facility of over 600 employees. Melissa Collins is an instructional designer with TDS with more than 15 years of instructional design and managerial experience. She has honed her skills and broadened her knowledge in a variety of settings, including healthcare, education, aerospace, waste management, and process industry. One quick note before I turn the session over to Greg Schaefer. As described more fully on this slide, the American Institute of Chemical Engineers assumes no legal liability or responsibility for the use or misuse of the content in this webinar. And now I give you Greg Schaefer. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you, Pam, and good afternoon to everyone. I want to say that I'm pleased to be able to conduct this webinar today on a very important topic, critical thinking. How about you, Melissa?
Well, like you, Greg, I'm also pleased to be here talking about this group, about critical thinking. As a long-term educator, that's something I hold near and dear to my heart, so I like it when we can discuss this. Why don't you go ahead and fill us in on what we're going to do today?
Okay, well, what we're going to do today is, of course, explore critical thinking. We're going to define what it is and the business impact when our employees do not possess critical thinking skills. We're going to look at the characteristics of those with critical thinking skills and how they differ from people that don't use them. We're going to look at some ideas on how to cultivate critical thinking skills in either ourselves or in those that work around us. In addition, I want to say we're going to do a brief exercise during the webinar today. That'll happen a little later, but it will require participants to have a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil to take that little exercise, okay?
All right, sounds good, Greg.
All right, well, let me begin with a question. Have you ever examined another person's solution to a problem and found yourself frustrated when you realize that this person's actions have actually compounded the problem rather than solving it? You know, you just got to ask, what were they thinking? So most of us have had that experience, and oftentimes it's caused by a lack of critical thinking on the part of that person.
Oh, definitely, Greg. I know I've had many encounters with that type of experience, and I'm sure our folks on the call have as well. Why don't you go ahead and define critical thinking for us and briefly explain why it's important?
Sure thing. Well, critical thinking is the ability to look into our own thought processes, to actively analyze and evaluate information, and then question the conclusions based on observations and our experiences using reasoning and good communications. I like how Richard Paul of the Center for Critical Thinking describes it. He says, critical thinking is thinking about your thinking while you're thinking in order to make your thinking better. So think about that. You know, while you're actively processing a problem, well, while you're thinking, you're analyzing your thought processes, you're questioning what you believe to be data, you're fleshing out assumptions and inferences in order to ensure that you have an improved outcome. So you're constantly thinking about the data you're processing and whether it's accurate or not. That's, I think, easily said, but not so easily done. So, you know, people who lack critical thinking ability often fail to take the time and the effort to collect all the details about a situation. So then in the absence of accurate detail and data, they make decisions that are expensive and they create headaches for us or often compound an already bad situation. And depending upon the type of decision and the situation involved, the cost of not arriving at the best solution, you know, it varies considerably. So we're going to review a couple examples of the business cost of this. So one thing I like to look at is the lost profit opportunity. Manufacturing facilities, let's say one that produces ethylene, when they don't get to make the product, they lose profit. So recent profit margins for ethylene have been in the range of about 30 cents a pound. So I'm going to use 30 cents a pound as a target number. So considering a unit that produces about 5 million pounds a day, that comes to around 200,000 pounds an hour. So if an employee makes a bad decision and causes that product to go off spec for just 1 hour, that's a lost profit of about $60,000. That's a very costly error in judgment, not using critical thinking. You know, making decisions without critical thinking in the operations environment can create all kinds of process upsets. We stress in our operations troubleshooting workshops that for operators, before you make a move because there's been an upset, you need to critically think and logically come to resolution about what you think the problem is so that you can make an accurate adjustment to the process. Because the problem is when you make an incorrect adjustment, not only do the variables that are already out of range become worse, you also drag more variables into the process upset, and you've disrupted the evidence of what was initially wrong, and you make it so cloudy, it's very difficult to discern what initially went wrong. So critical thinking in regards to troubleshooting operations is very important.
Oh, absolutely, Greg. You know, we hear from clients regularly that another area of cost associated with critical thinking, or shall I say a lack of, is equipment being brought down for repairs because of a misdiagnosis. For whatever reason, someone decides that a particular piece of equipment needs repair, but once the mechanics get into it, they find there's actually nothing wrong and there are no repairs needed. Now, what happens is this costs lots of time and effort, and not to mention the risks associated with taking something offline, working on it, and then returning it to service.
Yeah.
Now, if you ask me, that's a lot of unnecessary activity and risk.
Absolutely.
And there are other effects of poor decisions that have a costly impact, even if they're not really measured in a monetary value. You know, and these are a decreased effectiveness and a hampered work process, and their impact on the employees. And this impact can include many things, one of which is frustration for the work group, not to mention the frustration to the supervisors and the managers. A lack of critical thinking skills can result in a low-performing team of people.
Yeah, absolutely. That's correct. One other area I'd like you to think about is consider someone in supervisory staff or leadership position. Someone in that position may be faced with a situation where an employee comes to them and discusses something that may constitute a hostile work environment or something. If the person fails to address that properly, it could wind up in a lot of complications for the company, could be subject to very costly litigation and penalties. And you know, the most important thing about all these things we detailed, all these examples, is they're all avoidable, every one of them.
Absolutely. Okay, Greg, so using critical thinking skills is a way to navigate the decision-making field, and we can dig into details and carefully scrutinize them to be sure we don't have erroneous information. Is that where we are?
Yeah, critical thinking is definitely about the details, and one must be careful to monitor the collection of details that accurately portray the problem. You know, then the situation can be analyzed. But one thing to keep in mind is you don't want to get too myopic or lose sight of the big picture, because the realization that you're looking too narrowly at a problem is also a good example of critical thinking at work. You just can't lose sight of the big picture. I guess we call it tunnel vision, right?
Right. And, you know, Greg, all this critical thinking reminds me of a story about one of my favorite critical thinkers, Sherlock Holmes.
Oh, I like Sherlock Holmes, and he's making a comeback, you know. So what's your story on Sherlock?
Well, okay. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson went on a camping trip, and after sharing a good meal and a good conversation, they decided it was time to retire to their tent for the night. Around 3 a.m., Holmes nudges Watson and says, "Watson, look up at the sky and tell me what you see." Watson says, "Well, I see millions of stars." And Holmes says to him, "Okay, but what does that tell you?" Watson thinks on it for a minute, and then he replies, "Well, astronomically, it tells me there are millions of galaxies and potentially billions of planets. Astrologically, it tells me that Saturn is in Leo. Theologically, it tells me that God is great and we are small and insignificant. Horologically, it tells me it's about 3 a.m. And meteorologically, it tells me we're going to have a beautiful day tomorrow. What does it tell you, Holmes?" Holmes paused for a moment and then replied, "Well, it tells me someone stole our tent."
Very funny story and a good example. You're looking at the stars, you're not seeing the big picture that the tent's missing, and that's a great example of what we were just talking about, getting so bogged down into the details that you miss the big picture.
Absolutely. So, Greg, the need to have people think critically is pretty obvious, but, you know, how do we get there from here?
Well, we've discussed some definitions and used a couple of examples. Let's look closer at critical thinking and see what it's all about. There are 3 core values I want to share with about critical thinking, and the first one is clarity. So critical thinkers have these core values, and the first one is to seek clarity, being the state of being clear, the quality or state of being clear. So seeking clarity is being able to press through the unknown, seeing details that reveal the situation in its truest form, and then recognizing when you do not have clarity. The second value is accuracy of data, the accuracy of data. So in order to have clarity, obviously, and truly understand the situation, you need to have accurate details. The details have to be accurate. The challenge is, though, to know when your data or your details are sketchy because they're drawn from assumptions, from inferences, or maybe even from unreliable sources. So I like to ask, how do you know that you know your data is accurate? And finally, the third core value of critical thinkers is precision, being precise in terms of examination of details, the communication needed to collect the data, identification of a root problem and a solution. Critical thinking is all about analyzing a problem and arriving precisely at the best solution. So because of these values, there are distinct differences between individuals that possess critical thinking skills and those that lack them.
Yeah, that's really good information, Greg. So why don't you tell us, what are the characteristics of critical thinking?
Okay. Well, there are several characteristics associated with critical thinking, and we're going to view a couple at a time here. So the first ones on this slide are being rational and a self-awareness. Critical thinkers see things from a very rational perspective, and they can reason away information that doesn't fit the details of a situation. And having a keen sense of self-awareness is like the recognition of having, I have limited life experiences and perspective, and the realization that I filter information that comes to me, and I sometimes make inferences that are inaccurate. So validating correctness of my perception with additional facts or another person's observations becomes extremely important because I'm aware that I make errors. Critical thinkers also have the ability to question thoughts and logic, and I have a personal experience story that kind of, I think, really well illustrates the lack of using logic. So when I was a supervisor in a chemical facility, we used to make a byproduct that was only sometimes on specification. And at that time, when it was on spec, we would run it down into the good product tank. And other times, we would swap it over to a slop tank. I knew each Monday morning that the operations manager would be calling me when I was on shift that week and asking me which direction is the product flowing. Is it aligned to the good tank or otherwise? So to be prepared with an answer, I contacted an outside operator by the radio, and I said, would you check to see which tank this stream is aligned? So what do you think happened after that, Melissa?
Well, my guess is he radioed back and told you which way it was lined up.
No, that would be a wrong guess. Actually, he did not get back with me on the radio, ask any questions of clarification, or even report any action he was about to take. What he did do was come up to me later in the control room and mention that when he got there, it was not aligned to the good tank, but he went ahead and made the swap as I had requested. So,
oh, no.
Yeah, that is exactly what happened. And I really like that experience, and I use that story in several training sessions because it's a great example of a couple things. First of all, it certainly is a good example of miscommunication on our parts. Looking back, I think I could have been much more clear about what exactly I was asking him to do or what I did not want him to do. But it also illustrates someone taking action without using logic to ensure what they're about to do makes sense or not. We had not recently caught a sample. We did not have any discussion about the product being on spec or off spec. There was no mention to really make the swap, but he inferred out of what I said, the question I had for him, he inferred that he needed to make the swap. Now I'll say this, thank goodness that this was not a big issue. It wasn't a serious mistake. We simply swapped it back to the slop tank. But situations play out under circumstances like that all the time with much more serious results. And it's all because people do not think critically or use logic whether something even makes sense, what they're asked to do, or before they take action. So the second characteristic on this slide is exploring multiple options. So critical thinkers will look for more than one way to address a problem. They've learned that not accepting the first option that presents itself will give way typically to other ideas. And they explore multiple options after weighing the evidence, and they might actually make a list. They may just make a mental note of these things they've covered, but they do consider multiple options. They give themselves several paths forward. And you can always return to your first impulse or your first decision if you realize it's the best solution. But you give yourself multiple options to think about. All right, critical thinkers are also open-minded, and they challenge their own beliefs. So they ask themselves questions like, how do I know this to be so? What if I am mistaken about this data? What could be the outcome? How can I verify this? With whom should I check to validate this data? Is there some other way to look at this data to be sure whether it's correct or not? Or can I measure one piece of data against another to validate it? So that they are not afraid of input from others, and as a matter of fact, they would invite it to challenge their thought processes and search for disconnects. So in other words, I guess the bottom line is they're not defensive about what they're thinking. The next couple characteristics are they are not led astray by false logic, and they are skeptical about data when they're looking at it. So when given an explanation or possible answer that does not measure up to the data at hand, they can use that data to explain how the proposed solution doesn't meet the data, doesn't fit. One thing about this is, to others, a critical thinker at this point in time can seem to be kind of difficult to get along with, or they may seem difficult when information is presented as facts and they're seeking validation prior to acceptance. But it's a good quality to be a little skeptical and to not be led astray by false logic. Finally, critical thinkers actively seek and process information. They are problem solvers. Critical thinkers are the ones that people typically go to resolve problems in an organization. They enjoy the hunt. They enjoy seeking this information and solving problems. So these are the characteristics of critical thinkers.
Gotcha. But Greg, what about non-critical thinkers? I'm assuming, we've talked a lot about critical thinkers. Are there characteristics of non-critical thinkers?
Well, yes, there are, absolutely. So let's look at the characteristics of non-critical thinkers. First of all, non-critical thinkers will accept information at face value. Okay, to them, everything is either black or white, and there's no subtleties or shades in between, and they tend to just say, that's the information I was given, that must be the realistic information. So using information as given to you about a situation is good enough to cause an action without testing it or collecting other data for themselves. So think about that. That can be very detrimental to organizations' performance, especially plants, refineries, places where people rotate around the clock and they hand jobs off one to another as they go across shifts. The information given to someone at turnover and then acted upon blindly has created many problems for people. As a matter of fact, when I was in supervision on rotating shift, what I used to do, I used to practice of comparing the details that were given to myself and with the other operators when making relief to get a rough view of the state of the process. And then I had the operators review the equipment both outside and looking at the variables on the console to validate the information before we proceeded. And do you know why I did that?
Why?
We did that just because many times the details given at relief differed so much from person to person that when we compared stories, it became just a mandatory thing that we had to do to validate the information.
Makes lots of sense.
So non-critical thinkers are also closed-minded, and they tend to have an egocentric perspective. So they hold their thoughts and their beliefs and what they feel are facts as the only relevant ones. For whatever reason, they cling tightly to their perspective of things without getting information and additional insight from others, and that can be quite damaging to the outcome of their decisions. Okay, typically, non-critical thinkers are also passive participants. When it comes to challenges, they just rely on other people for instructions. They tend to let other people solve the problems. They basically lack effective problem-solving abilities. Or maybe for another reason, I should say this, they choose not to get involved in solving problems, and they pass the responsibility of calling shots onto other people. So one thing to note is that if there's anything worse than having a non-critical thinker in a passive role in your organization, it's having someone in an active role, giving direction to team members or making big decisions and not being a critical thinker.
Oh,
I think we could agree upon that.
Oh, absolutely. I think we've all been there at least once. So, Greg, now that we've identified the characteristics of those who think critically and those who don't, why don't you show us a simple word problem to demonstrate the perceptions of a situation? And this is where we're going to need the paper, right, Greg?
That's right. So, okay, I'll be glad to do this. This is going to be a little exercise on just hearing a story and answering a few questions. So, for this exercise, this is when you'll need the paper and the pen or pencil. And please number your paper from 1 to 10. And you're going to respond to some statements following the story. So for each of the statements following the story, you'll simply put a T if the statement is true, you'll put an F if the statement is false, and a question mark if you do not have enough information to answer the question. So let's look at the story. Here's the story. A businessman had just turned off the lights in the store when a man appeared and demanded money. The owner opened a cash register. The contents of the cash register were scooped up and the man sped away. A member of the police force was notified promptly. Okay, that's the story. So here are the statements. Let's start looking at the statements. And here's where you'll mark T for true, F for false, or question mark if you don't have enough information. Statement number 1. A man appeared after the owner had turned off the lights. Statement number 2. The robber was a man. Statement number 3. The man did not demand money. Statement number 4. The man who opened the cash register was the owner. Statement number 5. The store owner scooped up the contents of the cash register and ran away. Statement number 6. Someone opened the cash register. Statement number 7. After the man who demanded the money scooped up the contents of the cash register, he ran away. Statement number 8. While the cash register contained money, the story does not state how much. Statement number 9. The robber demanded money of the owner. Finally, statement number 10. It was broad daylight when the man appeared. Okay, so that was our 10 statements, and you're obviously going to self-grade your performance here. So let's see how you did. There are only 2 statements for which you can answer true or false out of all 10 of those statements. They are number 3, which is false, and number 6, which is true. So all the rest of the questions, you should have placed a question mark. Okay, if you answered a true or false to any other statement, you are inferring information out of what was said. And I know that some of you did this because I've rarely seen anyone complete the 10 statements and have them all accurate. There's just too many close statements here that lure you into believing you either read those details in the story or had those details revealed in the story, or the statements were close enough, but they aren't accurate enough. So this is a very powerful exercise that we use in our workshops to demonstrate to people just how much data they read into a situation. You're given a situation and we automatically infer data and read things into it. It's a very powerful exercise in regards to that. So thank you for participating in that.
That's a cool exercise, Greg. You know, and I know exactly what you mean about that whole critical thinking thing. I've experienced that myself. So how do people get to become critical thinkers?
Okay, well the key is to recognize that critical thinking is not an innate skill or ability. People are not naturally proficient at critical thinking. As a matter of fact, Alfred Mander said that thinking is skilled work. It is not true that we are naturally endowed with the ability to think clearly and logically without learning how or without practicing. So it's only through experience and exposure that these skills develop. Depending on the source of a person's education, their family environment, their life experiences, a person may miss the opportunity to develop critical thinking skills. And everyone falls somewhere on that continuum of being a good critical thinker or not having much. So I want to say in addition, Melissa, it's an error to assume that someone who has a college degree automatically has critical thinking skills or they have developed them. According to the Critical Thinking Community website, studies on the state of critical thinking in higher education report that most college faculty at all levels lack, quote, a substantive concept of critical thinking, unquote, and that rote memorization short-term study habits are still the norm for students. And that leads to a very low development of critical thinking ability.
I see that very often. As a former school teacher, I know that to be true, at least at the lower levels. One of the things we've seen is that many of the instructors have never been trained in creating test questions, for example. So it's easier to create a test that says, select A, B, C, D, as opposed to writing something that may be more open-ended that could elicit a more critical thinking response. So you're right. Because of the training or just because of the way it's always been done, just because someone's coming out of a college program doesn't necessarily mean they receive the instruction that helps them critically think to the level we need them to once they get into industry.
Correct, yeah. So what does this mean for employers? What it means for employers is that many employees entering the workforce will not have the ability to think critically and work through complex situations. So awareness of the problem is the first step. But I venture to say probably a lot of people are aware of this already. That's why they're attending the webinar today. So there's good news. A lack of critical thinking skills is not a permanent problem. These skills can be developed, and that's what we're going to look at. So like a muscle, the brain must be exercised in order to gain strength and enhance performance. With proper training, minds can be sharpened, and the ability to analyze and process and interpret data, it can be honed. So through carefully designed training programs, employees can learn to challenge their own thought processes, to analyze situations, and to arrive at critical and logical conclusions. So the more practice a person receives, just like Alfred Mander reminded us, it takes practice. The more practice a person receives on these skills, the more efficiently and effectively that person becomes at spotting faulty logic or false premises and arriving at good decisions. However, there's no quick and easy fix. The development of these skills takes time and practice. Even the best of critical thinkers are aware that continued honing of their skills is a lifelong endeavor. I like to say it's like great leadership. It's a journey, not a destination. So you got to continue to hone those skills. So let's look at some steps that we can take to develop either our own or an employee's critical thinking skills. And we'll start by looking at a couple more quotes. One by Lotha says, "To realize that you do not understand is a virtue. Not to realize you do not understand is a defect."
I like that one. That kind of reminds me of a little less eloquent quote from a humorist, Ray Stevens. I like Ray Stevens. And his quote says, "The less you know, the more you think you know, because you don't know you don't know."
That's right. That's a good one. And they align with each other. As we can see, awareness is very important, and both these quotes help us to realize that not possessing critical thinking skills falls under the category of unconscious incompetence. You really just don't know that you don't know. So one of the first steps in helping someone to improve their critical thinking is to help them see the need. And I mean it sincerely. Kind of a word of caution here is I don't think it's very smart to embark on a project of trying to covertly develop someone by challenging their thoughts and questioning their logic, because most likely I think this is going to turn out to be very counterproductive, as the target of your assistance might very likely assume you are the problem. They might write the whole experience off as you just being difficult to deal with, or you lack confidence in them, or you just have a very high level of control orientation. So I'm a believer in communication. I would suggest that you have a discussion with the person about your intentions to help them develop their skills. So make it known that you're going to help them. Another prudent step would be to examine the environment and the culture within the organization. And you're looking to discover hindrances to effective learning in this area. And we see maybe 4 areas that you could look at. The first one is an area that most organizations can improve upon. That's the hidden thought process challenge. And when we say hidden thought process, this is where we don't process our thoughts out loud or explain our logic and how we arrived at decision. So other people around us, they can't learn from what they have not seen. So imagine trying to learn how to dance, let's say, for example, but the expert dancers were invisible. So how could you see what the moves were? And how would you learn the steps? How would you be able to see how it's done well? Well, you wouldn't be able to. So what we have to do is to openly discuss the process of analysis and how we arrive at determinations. Another thing to look at is when you're looking at the culture, is there something within the culture that is enabling or disabling? So you need to ask questions like, does the culture enable employees to defer thinking and decision-making to higher levels? I hear that as a problem with a lot of organizations. Sometimes people enable others to defer their critical thinking by providing the answers to questions or simply just giving work directives all the time. Or perhaps it's a disabling environment that in some way discourages people from thinking critically. Either of these would tend to let people off the hook and remove them from the responsibility when it comes to being able to think their way through developing situations. A third thing is to look at the environment and see if it's a safe learning environment. You know, ask, is there a willingness to permit people to make mistakes as they practice critical thinking skills? In terms of support, when employees start to practice critical thinking, it's going to be awkward for them. They're going to make mistakes. They're not going to be perfect. So errors in judgment must be managed in a supportive way and an encouraging way that helps the learner see where they can improve their thought processes. But you don't want to shut someone down and have them revert to deferring decisions up the chain of command, so to speak. Finally, is it possible to use a mentor or coach? That's a very helpful thing, but you need to be careful that the coach or the mentor possesses the patience and the communication skills, I would say facilitative skills as well, to work closely with those that are in development. The individual chosen to work with people to develop their skills, they have to be carefully selected. Too often we see that, oh, well, this person can just go work with this other person, and it should be very carefully done. They have to also understand that hidden thought process so that they are very cognizant about their need to explain their train of thoughts or lead the person down that path of analyzing problems and validating data. All right, so now let's design some training to help improve people. So, one of the things to consider when it comes to designing training, do we want a tool or do we want a training program? Sometimes there's tools people are offered to help them make decisions or think critically, but a process that simply provides a tool, a step-by-step how-to, it's not bad in itself, but if you think about it, if I just follow a tool, I'm not really learning to think critically. So you have to have a training that will allow people to go through a process where they have to reveal to themselves when they need to think deeper or dig deeper into the details, not just this one step-by-step process. Because sometimes a step-by-step process will lead to a false sense of security, that people can make these decisions. Either they have the false sense of security or we have the security in them that they're able to make decisions. So when selecting a training program, it needs to be a training program that provides practice opportunities. It should be carefully and methodically designed to introduce the key concepts, but to give plenty of time for practice activities to increase the comprehension and the learning retention. So these programs should provide individuals with a supportive learning environment, like we mentioned before, and the opportunity to safely learn from his or her mistakes. All right, so that's kind of the training program as we see it and some of the process. But let's look at what we can do as individuals ourselves to develop some critical thinking in ourselves. So first thing I would say is slow down and question your thoughts. And I know that might sound a little funny in today's hurried up world, but seriously, slow down and question your thoughts. Too often we think of a resolution to a situation and it seems to address what we need, and we just move with it. But especially if, you know, we have this impulse to just move, it might be time to slow down and consider where we might be having erroneous information or incomplete solutions, and where we need to stop and think a little bit more critically about something. So first of all, just slow down. This is a favorite tool of mine. I like this one, is how do I know? So I think one of the hardest things for people to learn is when they are making assumptions instead of dealing with factual data. Like in the exercise we just did, a lot of assumptions tend to be made there. And I share this challenge all the time in our workshops that, you know, first of all, we all make assumptions every day. And when you stop and think about it, we make a lot of assumptions. And the key is to realize that we couldn't live very efficiently or effectively if we didn't make assumptions, but when is it safe to proceed with our assumptions, and when do we need to stop and do some additional inquiry or examination to flesh our assumptions out? So when someone learns to, A, recognize that they're making assumptions, to B, to pause and catch themselves prior to making judgment errors based on those assumptions, they've made steps toward being a critical thinker. Next is consider multiple alternatives. Don't get myopic or fixated on one path or one resolution to a problem. Don't get too hung up on the data or any one option. You know, step back, as Sherlock Holmes did, and see if there's a big picture to be seen. So don't get too down in the weeds and too tunnel visioned on your problems. Another is, going back to characteristics of critical thinkers, compare your data. Compare your data with someone else that can validate your data. Seek ways to confirm what you think you know. Ask why is another good thing to do when you ask why. Why do I believe that to be true? Why should this option be considered as the final choice? Why do I believe the data to be accurate? Another thing to do is to get others' opinions. Seek different opinions and viewpoints. Don't be afraid of contrary opinions or different perspectives. As a matter of fact, I would coach people to invite people to have opposing ideas. Invite people to be critical of your plan and your thoughts, and because exploring and reasoning through alternative solutions can only make your critical thinking skills stronger and more effective. So don't be afraid of a varied opinion. Next, I would say, be careful not to jump to conclusions on minimum data. So this is very similar to the first tip of slowing down, but this one speaks, I think, more of realizing when there's a scarcity of information or maybe some missing pieces that will aid in arriving at the correct decision if you just take the time to seek them out.
You know, those are all great tips, Greg. How about if we take a minute now to examine some ways that we can develop critical thinking skills in others?
Okay. Well, first off, and we've kind of mentioned this already, be careful not to give answers or directions to people. So that might seem a little cruel, but what this does, this enables employees to rely on someone else to do the thinking. This is a real challenge for leaders and managers because most people that progress in organizations are problem solvers, and they do it quite well. So it's really easy for those people just to solve the problem themselves and give the answer to the person that comes looking for it. But if, you know, so you want to not provide answers for people, but if you feel like you must provide an answer at times, you need to at least remember about that hidden thought process. So do make your thought processes visible so people can at least see how you arrived at it. But don't just give answers to people. Have them work for it. Next would be ask for details and explanations about how your employees arrive at conclusions. Sometimes people come to us and they have answers to problems, and a lot of times they're the correct answers. But don't just assume that they were critically thought out. there could have been a flaw in their logic, or there might even been another solution or fit. So just ask some questions about how did you arrive at this conclusion, what details did you look at. Have them explain their thought processes and look for opportunities to help them improve it. The next bullet says, allow problems to be worked. And this is kind of similar to the first one. Again, most people in organizations that are supervisors or managers, they're problem solvers. So it's our first impulse is to jump in and fix everything. But be careful not to dominate the thinking area. Allow room for other people to come and to take part. Perhaps you can do this by asking them the questions that you think in your mind. Because, as we go through a critical thinking in our own mind, we're asking questions, we're answering questions, and those hidden thought processes are taking place. So just the questions you're thinking in your mind, put them out to other people and let them do the processing and hold back on that answer you come up with and lead them in a kind of a Socratic method that helps them become a problem solver and critical thinker. One thing that I found that has been helpful for people in my experience is to give some structure. Structure is very helpful for people. Give them some structure around how they can make decisions. Give them some guidance on what type of decisions need input from others or maybe management approval, which ones they can make independently. Maybe how much data you want them to have or the number of alternative options that should be considered prior to them making a judgment. And this frees people up and gives them some latitude within the boundaries you set for them to testify their critical thinking ability and work on it. When people propose a solution to a problem, request alternatives that they may have considered. Ask them to select one of the proposed ones and give them some feedback accordingly. So it's kind of like I had this experience before. I had a supervisor years ago that told me, don't ever come to my office with a problem unless you have at least 2 recommendations on how to address it and which one you selected and the reasons why you've selected that. At the time I thought, boy, this guy's just trying to get me to do his job. And he was trying to get me to do his job. Because once I developed that skill and I was able to do that, I was promoted into that position actually. So it was a very helpful thing for him to do for me. Next is ask questions to guide people. So this is that Socratic method of when people get stuck, don't just give them the answer or the solution. Ask them some questions to help guide them toward solving the problem themselves. Don't you do it. You just lead them through those Socratic questions. Help them think about things, help them process data so that they can do the critical thinking themselves. And finally, just be patient with people because, again, going back to what Alfred Manners told us, it is not going to happen without a lot of practice and skill development. So be patient with people.
Greg, that was a great presentation, and I know that I've learned a lot about critical thinking skills and how to improve them. How about if we take a few minutes, and I know we have a little bit more time, how about if we take a few minutes and open up the floor for some questions? Pam, are there folks in the audience who might have some questions for us?
Oh, hi, Melissa. Hi, Greg. Yeah, we have a lot of questions. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, we hear you.
Okay, great. Yes, a lot of questions have come in during the webinar, and we'll take more. We have a little time. Let's get started. It's difficult to be a critical thinker. You can't just say you want to be one and then proof you are one. Have you witnessed a non-critical thinker grow into one? If so, how did they achieve this? And did they need a lot of help?
Oh, absolutely. So the question is, have I ever seen a non-critical thinker develop into a critical thinker? Well, yes, I have. And yes, people do need help. Some of the tips that we gave here today in the webinar were used to help these people develop into critical thinkers. And I am an example of that. Like I said, I had that supervisor that at one point challenged me, don't just come to me with problems. Think it through yourself. Think of some possible resolutions. Bring at least 2 and make sure you can explain why you've selected one of them and why you didn't select the other. I mean, he really forced me to start reasoning things out and think critically on my own and to consider others and get other alternatives from my coworkers and consider all those things before I went to him. So I'm an example of a person who was, I think, a non-critical thinker at one point in time in my life, and through the assistance of others and some rigorous training, I might say, kind of became a critical thinker.
Right, and I've also seen a similar thing with some of the folks that I've mentored in the instructional design arena. They had kind of come from the place of where the professor's telling you everything, and when they got to me, then I would kind of walk them through the process and allow them to make mistakes in a safe environment. And it was really interesting to see how when they came in, they wanted me to tell them, what do I do now, what do I do now? And then with that coaching and praise as they would do things well, and that gentle nudge when they weren't doing it quite right, they actually developed a safe place where they felt like they could ask questions, and eventually they were questioning me. And I think that's really healthy when they can get to that point.
Yeah, good. That displayed that they developed critical thinking skills. I want to add that I actually had a role on my unit at one point in time where my immediate supervisor told me to not provide any answers to people because the person in the position before I was there was a giver. He provided everything for people, everything from, hey, where can I find a pencil, or where do I get that form, how do I find the procedure, how do I do this? And my job at the time was to not provide anyone any answers, just to simply guide them toward thinking through processes and identifying how they can resolve problems themselves. So yes, that's definitely possible.
Okay, great. Thank you. We've had a few questions like the one that just came in, so I'll ask this one. Will you provide some guidance on how to interact with non-critical thinkers in positions of authority? How do you help those above you think critically?
Oh, okay. Well, I would say that one should step back and think critically about doing that before they start. You know, we had a phrase, a career-limiting move, when I was in the business, but I think it's something that definitely can be done. I'm a proponent and an advocate of, shall we say, upward management, helping people above me to be successful. Because you don't have control over those people. Typically, they're assigned to be in leadership over you, and you just have to find a way to survive and thrive and stay alive under those people. So I think it can be done, but I guess you'd have to analyze the person and know what their personality type is, where is their security level if they're a non-critical thinker. But I think a good way to do it is approach things from the intelligent curiosity kind of standpoint. Ask those Socratic questions to them to kind of help guide them to think of things.
Right, and I've had a similar experience when I was interning back in aerospace. I had an instance where I had a supervisor who didn't always think critically, and it was essential for my role that some critical thought go into the process. And so sort of the approach I tried to use was I tried to be very diplomatic and tried to verbalize my thought process out loud, but did it in a way of going, okay, you know, Bob, here's what I'm thinking, and I just wanted you to maybe verify that I'm on the right track. And so I would kind of tell him the process, and oftentimes Bob hadn't even thought about it, but he would go, you're absolutely right, that's what we should do. So trying to show them the process without them feeling like you're trying to impose on them or you're telling them they don't know what they're doing. So.
Yeah, it could be that you do some of those things. If there's a critical decision to be made and you think they might need some assistance, is to list out several options and go to them and explain, hey, this is what I've been looking at. We need to make a decision. I'm thinking we should go here, and kind of guide them in the area that would be helpful. I always looked at my role was to help people be successful no matter what I had to do to help them be successful.
Right, and I found that sometimes in that coaching role, you just have to be sort of careful because you don't want to give the impression that you don't have confidence in them, but there are many times as a supervisor myself when someone would come up and they would go through the critical thought process, and I was relieved as they'd gone through it because I didn't necessarily have the answer myself. And then as they walked through it, I could come to that answer and absolutely, let's go for it. So I think it's just kind of a gentle position you have to take, kind of a coaching from the bottom up.
Yeah, well said.
Okay, how do you avoid taking a long time to make decisions when you're critically thinking and keeping an open-minded approach?
Okay. So how do you avoid falling into analysis paralysis, right? Well, I think, first of all, I want to say that I don't know that you always, I know that people don't always have a lot of time to make decisions. So sometimes it's just evaluating how much time do I have to make this decision, and sometimes you don't have a lot of time to make decisions. But I'm assuming this question is about I do have a lot of time, and how do I not get bogged down too much in the details to be able to make a decision? And I would say collect enough data to validate the fact that your information is correct and you do have some options to consider given the time frame. And then once you've nailed down a few options that you can consider, then figure out which one of those is the best option for you and make a decision and go.
I think the other thing too, Greg, is to keep your scope well defined. Sometimes people try to eat the whole elephant all at once, and they're looking at too many variables or too many things. They're trying to solve all of the world problems. And I think an important thing is to break it into manageable chunks and manage that critical thinking process. So any dialogue or discussion that's happening is relevant and directly related to the chunk you're trying to solve.
Very good point. Good.
Okay. There are a few questions about graduate students. Could you please provide tips to improve critical thinking in graduate students, and how would you assess critical thinking in a body of students?
That's a great question, and having been a graduate student myself in instructional technology, what I have found worked really well in some of my classes at that level is kind of like Greg was talking about, this giving students a problem and using sort of a Socratic method to have them walk through it. Leaving it somewhat open-ended, whatever the problem is. For example, in my discipline, learn about performance improvement systems, ways you can perform. And send them off, give them some guidelines and send them off, and then have them bring that information back and talk through it. I mean, the instructor, of course, needs to have familiarity with the content as well. But using that Socratic method and having them do it as a group was really helpful as well, because other students could come in and punch holes or ask questions, and it really made the students think it through and made sure that when they came to class they were well prepared with their argument. So instead of, I guess what I'm saying is, instead of just saying, answer A, B, C, or D, make sure that you, especially with graduate students, that there's plenty of discussion and there's pre-work that's done prior to the discussion, so they come in armed with the knowledge they need to have a meaningful discussion, and the instructor needs to know where they want that student to end up. What is your goal for this? What do you want the students to know? And then that instructor needs to continue to keep the students on that path until they reach that end goal. So it's a guided process, and it needs to be thought out ahead of time.
Okay, thank you. I like critical thinkers. I like having them on my team. Do you have tips for the hiring process, how we can test critical thinking in a short time period?
Ooh, good question. Well, I would say perhaps, I'm not sure of an assessment or anything you can give to evaluate critical thinking skills at this moment in time, but you could, and I've been on an interview process, so I know most of the time you've got 30 minutes to an hour to talk to someone. And sometimes there's a presentation involved in that. But perhaps it's posing a problem to them and ask them to start logically thinking about how they would critically think their way through it.
One of my friends, to that end, that's kind of a tricky thing. Like Greg said, you don't always have a lot of time. But one of the questions that a friend of mine was asked in a job interview, completely random, was, okay, why are manhole covers round? And that had nothing to do with the job, but it was asking the person to think about something they might have never thought about and just walk through the process. They may not have gotten the answer right, but it allowed the interviewer to see how they might arrive at a conclusion. And I mean, did they just give up? Did they just go, I don't know, and I'm not going to answer that question? Or
what's that have to do with the job, right?
Right, exactly. And the answer is because that's the only shape that won't fall in on itself.
That's right. The square one would fall in if it went in diagonally.
Right. So maybe there's, I don't know any other questions off the top of my head, but maybe there are some things like that that are not really designed to trip somebody up, but that are designed to at least give you a brief opportunity to see how their brain works. And
yeah, just a little insight into whether they are critical thinkers or not.
Right, and to see if they become defensive, because that's another thing, you can indicate defensiveness and see how embracing or resistant they are to the critical thinking concept and being questioned.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, how do you balance the need to show that you know what you're doing in a new role while still thinking critically and seeking the information you need from peers?
Oh, that's a good question. Can you read that one more time, Pam?
Okay, you know what, let's see, I think I just deleted it.
Well, I know what it was. It was how do you balance
The need to know what you're doing while
know what you're doing with your inquisitiveness and trying to collect data from peers and things like that, right?
Right. That's it.
Well, I think that just, I'm a fan of intellectual curiosity. And I think when we present to people that we just like to explore options, we're just curious. Everybody has varied information and sees the world from different perspectives, and they had different life experiences. We all filter information differently. So to be curious from an intelligence standpoint is just to simply say, I'm thinking this about this situation, Melissa. What are you thinking about this? And I think when people feel like we're only trying to explore and gain more knowledge, it's non-threatening. But then, and I think I hear in this question is that I don't want to look like I don't know the answer myself. So I think the possibility of that, this is the situation. This is kind of what I'm thinking about it. This is what I think the resolution is. What are your thoughts on this matter? Kind of dispels all that and opens the door for more information from my peer.
Right, and I would agree with that, Greg, and that's sort of kind of that bottom to top managing of someone as well. Throw it out there so it's not threatening, but so they know you actually are thinking about it and you have information, but that you're seeking their expertise and information. And also I think it's really important when you're critically thinking to admit when you don't know something. That, I really don't know, but I'll get back with you on that, because I think sometimes just being honest and saying you don't know but you'll get back on it builds you more credibility than if you just make something up.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one last question. Would case studies be a good training tool for critical thinking skills?
Oh, absolutely. We use case studies in some of our training workshops, and they're very effective to be able to see how people process information and data and whether they're critical thinkers or not, and helps them to develop as well.
And I think it's also important, if you have the time and the luxury, and you can do case studies individually and with them working in a group, I think you get a different perspective, because some folks may be good critical thinkers but don't do it as well in a group and vice versa. So I think if you can kind of get a more holistic view.
Yeah, well, and people can also kind of hide out in the group.
Right.
I can be a non-critical thinker and have 2 or 3 critical thinkers in my group and come off shining. So it's good to do things on an individual basis as well as group format.
Right, and we've also seen the folks in the group who kind of ramrod the whole thing. We're all going to come
they dominate, yeah.
So I do think that it's important to, if you can, to get both perspectives and get a more holistic view of the person doing the critical thinking.
Okay.
Okay, thanks for that answer. Sorry, but we are out of time. So if your question was not answered today, please send it to producer@aiche.org. So now, on behalf of the American Institute of Chemical Engineers and everyone who attended today, I'd like to thank Greg Schaefer and Melissa Collins for this informative presentation. Thanks also to our participants for your cooperation and thoughtful questions. Please visit aiche.org to replay this webinar or to view and sign up for our many others. Goodbye, and we hope to see you again in a webinar soon.
Thank you very much.